They always show the bravery in the movies, the clean uniforms, the determined looks before the ramp drops, the heroic speeches from the commanders. It's all a lie. You want to know what the morning of June 6th really felt like. It felt like being locked inside a floating metal coffin. And the smell. God, I will never ever forget that smell. It was a sickening, suffocating mixture of cheap diesel fuel exhaust, bitter, salty seawater, and the sour stench of vomit.
The grim dawn of June 6th, 1944. Operation Overlord was in full swing, launching the largest amphibious invasion in human history, straight through a violent, unforgiving storm. For the young men of the very first wave, heading toward the bloodiest sector, codenamed Omaha, Allied command had painted a dangerously comforting picture. They were repeatedly told that massive naval and aerial bombardments had already pulverized the elite German coastal defenses. They were promised an easy walk.
I remember the final briefing back in England. They gathered us in these massive canvas tents, handed out hot coffee, and pointed at the maps on the board. "It's going to be a walk in the park, boys," the lieutenant said. And the crazy thing is, we actually believed him. We were 19, maybe 20 years old. We joked around, played poker for cigarettes, and talked about what we were going to do when we finally got to Paris. They told us the Navy would pound the beach so hard that the sand would literally melt into glass. They said there wouldn't be a single German left alive to fire a shot. All we had to do was stroll up the beach and secure the craters.
But Allied intelligence had made a catastrophic, fatal error regarding the sector known as Omaha Beach. They believed the area was defended by a single, under-equipped regiment of static troops, mostly old men, young boys, and wounded veterans recovering from the Eastern Front. However, just days before the invasion, the elite, battle-hardened 352nd Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht had secretly moved into position. They were waiting in untouched, heavily fortified concrete bunkers with their deadly MG-42 machine guns perfectly sighted on every single inch of the sand.
If it was supposed to be a walk in the park, why did they load us like pack mules? My commanding officer made absolutely sure every man had his full assault kit. I had my M1 Garand rifle, 80 rounds of ammunition in heavy bandoliers, 4 fragmentation grenades, a bayonet, a heavy entrenching tool, a bulky gas mask, a first aid pouch, 2 canteens of water, and 3 days' worth of field rations. Altogether, the gear weighed almost 80 pounds. It dug into your shoulders and messed with your balance. When you're standing on dry land, 80 pounds is heavy, but you can manage it. You can march. But water changes everything. Nobody warned us that this gear, this precious military equipment that was supposed to keep us alive in France, was about to become our executioner. We were wearing thick wool uniforms and heavy canvas webbing. Once that fabric soaked up the freezing seawater, the weight completely doubled. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were heavy iron anchors. We were anchors about to be thrown into a violent, bloody storm.
The landing craft slowly approached the shallow waters of Omaha Beach. As they crossed the final few hundred yards, the deafening, distant roar of Allied naval artillery was suddenly joined by a new, much more terrifying sound. The German defenders inside their concrete bunkers had patiently waited for the perfect range, and now they opened fire. Mortar and artillery shells began to erupt in the water all around the approaching boats, sending massive geysers of freezing seawater crashing down onto the terrified men inside. The trap was finally sprung.
We could hear the shrapnel and machine gun fire pinging against the thick outside armor of our metal boat. It sounded like a handful of gravel being thrown violently against a tin roof. But the absolute worst part was the waiting. You are trapped in this steel box. You know the front door is about to open, and you know exactly what is waiting on the other side. My stomach was tied in knots. I gripped my heavy M1 rifle so hard, my knuckles were completely white. I looked at the guy standing right in front of me, in the third row. He was a young kid from a farm in Iowa. He was staring blindly at the steel ramp, quietly murmuring a prayer with trembling lips. I closed my eyes and waited for the horrific mechanical grinding sound that would seal our fate. And then it happened. The roaring diesel engine suddenly idled. The entire boat violently lurched forward and threw us off balance as the flat hull hit the hidden sandbar. And then came that terrible, heavy, metallic clanking noise. The heavy steel ramp dropped down into the churning water. Time completely stopped for me in that exact moment. The second that ramp fell flat, the dark, claustrophobic shadow of the boat was replaced by a blinding grey light and a solid wall of deafening noise. But before anyone could even take a single step forward to exit the craft, the German machine guns opened up on us.
The coxswains piloting the landing craft were terrified of getting stuck on the sandbars and becoming stationary targets. In the absolute panic of the moment, many dropped their ramps entirely too early, hundreds of yards from the shore, right into the deep, churning water. The men were violently ordered to disembark into the freezing English Channel under a relentless, crisscrossing hail of German machine gun, fire, and artillery shrapnel. There was no cover, no strategy, and no retreat. They simply had to jump into the abyss.
Your sergeant was screaming at the top of his lungs, quote one, but he didn't even finish the sentence before a mortar shell took his head clean off. We didn't have a choice anymore. The boat was rapidly filling with water and dead bodies, so we just blindly threw ourselves over the steel edge into the freezing ocean. The shock of the cold water instantly paralyzed my lungs. I couldn't draw a breath. And then the true nightmare began. The weight, that 80 pounds of military gear that was supposed to save my life, immediately acted like a concrete block tied to my waist. The heavy canvas webbing, the soaked wool uniform, the ammunition, it dragged me straight down beneath the surface. I was drowning. My frozen, numb fingers frantically clawed at the stiff buckles of my harness, but they wouldn't release. It was pure, primal panic. When I opened my burning eyes underwater, I saw a vision of pure hell. Dozens of my friends were sinking right alongside me, desperately thrashing in the dark water. Their heavy packs were pulling them down to the ocean floor, and they were grabbing at anything they could reach, including each other, just trying to stay alive. I watched them drown, their mouths open in silent screams, pulling their own brothers down with them into the dark. I somehow managed to slip my heavy shoulder straps off and kicked my way up to the surface. I gasped for air, but all I swallowed was seawater and fuel. But the water wasn't blue or green anymore. There were so many bodies floating around me, so many men torn apart by the crossfire, that the ocean itself had changed. I was swimming through a thick, sticky, dark red tide. The blood of hundreds of American boys was literally washing up against my face. I was choking on it. Every time a wave crashed over me, it tasted like salt and copper. It tasted like death.
For those who miraculously survived the water, the true test of Omaha Beach had only just begun. Between the crashing waves and the relative safety of the shingle bank lay over 300 yards of completely open, perfectly flat sand. There were no bomb craters to hide in. The German gunners had clear, unobstructed sight lines from their elevated concrete bunkers. To cross that vast expanse of open beach required stepping into a concentrated wall of flying lead. Many soldiers simply froze. Psychologists call it combat paralysis. The human brain simply cannot process that level of sheer terror, and the primal instinct to survive forces the body to press flat against the earth and refuse to move, even as the bullets rip the ground apart all around them.
I dragged my body out of the red surf and just collapsed onto the wet sand. I didn't have my rifle anymore. I had dropped it in the ocean just to keep from drowning. I was completely defenseless, crawling on my stomach like a crushed insect. The noise was so loud it felt like physical blows to the sides of my head. Sand was exploding in my eyes every time a machine gun burst stitched across the beach. I managed to crawl behind a rusted steel anti-tank obstacle, one of those giant metal crosses they called Czech hedgehogs. I pressed my face so hard into the wet sand I could taste the grit and the salt. I was trying to make myself as small as humanly possible, praying to a god I wasn't even sure was listening anymore.
By midday, the impossible was achieved. Through sheer, desperate willpower and unimaginable sacrifice, small groups of American soldiers finally breached the bluffs and silenced the German guns. But the cost of this victory was apocalyptic. On Omaha Beach alone, over 2,400 young men were killed, wounded, or went missing in just a few short hours of combat. The sand was entirely hidden beneath a thick carpet of broken bodies and shattered military equipment. The freezing water of the English Channel ran thick with blood for days.
People always ask me if I feel like a hero. I don't. I am not a hero. The real heroes are the ones who never made it off that wet sand. The ones who are still lying under those endless rows of white crosses in Normandy today. I am just an old man who got incredibly, inexplicably lucky. But that luck came with a very heavy price. You see, survivor's guilt is a terrible disease that eats away at your soul slowly. Every time I watch those Hollywood movies about D-Day, with their dramatic music and glorious slow-motion charges, it makes me physically sick to my stomach. There was absolutely no glory on that beach. There was only sheer terror, unspeakable pain, and terrified teenage boys crying out for their mothers as they bled to death in the cold salt water. The army gave me a silver medal for what I did that morning. I put it in a dark drawer and I haven't looked at it since 1945. A small piece of shiny metal cannot replace the brothers I lost in the surf. It cannot silence the desperate screams that still wake me up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night. It has been over 80 years now. I've lived a long, full life. But there is a reason I moved to the Midwest, far away from the coast. I have never been back to the beach. My grandchildren always ask me to go to the ocean with them on vacation, but I always make an excuse. I just can't do it, because whenever I stand on a shoreline and hear the sound of the waves crashing against the sand, I don't hear the water. I hear the deafening clank of that heavy steel ramp falling down. And whenever I look out at the deep ocean, I don't see beautiful blue water. All I see is a dark, sticky red tide. The war doesn't end when the shooting stops. The war stays inside you. And no matter how old I get, part of me is still standing in that metal box, shaking in the dark, waiting to die.